I'm a Good podcast. So good to have you here today. It's a Wednesday, and on Wednesdays, as you know, if you keep up with our little schedule around here, we talk about faith and the common good. Today's June 7th, and I got to tell you, I am so excited for this day. It's going to be a fabulous day. I was able to have a conversation with one of my mentors, one of my favorite people in the world, someone who I call my bishop. That's Bishop Mariann Budde. She's the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C. In the Episcopal Church, things are organized with different levels of leaders. Bishops are one of these. She's going to talk a bit about this. What is a bishop? What do they do? Now, I'm not an Episcopalian, but she's my bishop. In fact, if you're looking for a bishop, consider taking on Mariann. She's fantastic. I met Mariann a long while ago when I was first starting the church that I was pastor of for 20 years called Solomon's Porch. In 1999, I met Mariann Budde. She was a pastor of a church just up the hill, an Episcopal church. And she was the most kind, the most welcoming to me, a young evangelical pastor starting another church right in her neighborhood, right down the street, above a little coffee shop. We had this little rented space in an upper loft area, and we were starting a new project on how to be Christian in the world, a new church in the evangelical tradition. And Mariann, an Episcopal priest, welcomed us in, came and spoke at our church. She's one of the few people that actually in the early days came and spoke at our church. She was so gracious to us. She's become a lifelong friend. Her and her husband, Paul, are tremendous supporters of so much goodness in the world, and I count them as such good and close friends. So she wrote this fabulous book called How We Learn to Be Brave. Now here's the thing. Mariann, you might recognize her or know her. If you remember a few years ago when then President Donald Trump chose to clear out protesters in early June that were protesting outside Lafayette Square, right outside the back of the White House. He had the military clear those protesters out so he could walk from the White House across that Park Plaza to stand in front of St. John's Church and hold up a Bible, a photo op, as if to say his role of clearing these protesters, his law and order call, was ordained by God, not only using the Bible as the prop in his hand, but St. John's Episcopal Church. It's often referred to as the Church of the Presidents, right behind him. Well, that church is in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. That church is in the purview and the care of Mariann Budde, the bishop of the Episcopal Church of Washington. So she was asked to comment on it, and she did, and it was fantastic. She was a leading voice in all of this, found her own way to be brave. Now, Mariann has been a growing voice of bravery and common good and faith for decades. I've had the privilege of knowing that. If you're new to Mariann Budde, you're going to have the privilege of finding this out. I don't know what you think of bishops, but this one's fantastic. So get ready to have a really great time. Now, I did record this a day ago, but this is live right now. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So good morning, Jim. Good morning, Yabitz. Good to see you all on here. We try the best that we can to give you a chance to interact with each other, to talk to each other. Both Jim and Yabitz are on YouTube. You can do this on YouTube. It's our preferred place, but you're welcome to do it over on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or the other places where we're putting this broadcast out. Twitch is another place. Maybe not even heard of Twitch, but we're there. So share this broadly if you would, and share it with others if you think that they'd be interested, both live and then in the recorded versions. And the podcast for this will come out here this morning as well, if you do into the audio only. So here it is. She's written this really great book. We're going to talk about it, How We Learn to Be Brave, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith. I'm a big fan of the book, big fan of Mariann Budde, and here's our conversation from a few days ago. And I'll be in the chat sort of keeping up on things best that I can. So now we act like we haven't been chit-chatting and haven't been friends for 25 years. Sorry. Okay. Hey, Mariann, so good to have you here. The Common Good podcast feels so fortunate to be talking with Bishop Mariann Budde, and especially about this great book of yours, this terrific book on how we learn to be brave. Mariann, thanks for this. Thanks for this book. Let's start with this. What does it mean to be a bishop of the Washington Diocese? What before we get into the the great book that you've written and what it means to be an author. What is a bishop?
Oh, Doug, thank you. Thank you. It's great to be with you. I would say to be a bishop in the Episcopal Church is to be an elected leader of a geographic region that we call a diocese. And in my case, that is the 86 congregations, Episcopal congregations, and affiliated institutions, schools, few agencies in the Washington, D.C. area, including, which is the District of Columbia, and 4 Maryland counties. So the big part of my job is to be a spiritual leader and a guide, an encourager, equiper of leaders, and a supporter of congregations. It has a public role. The Washington National Cathedral is a part of our diocese, and that is perhaps the most symbolic representation of a civic public arena forum for
Mhm.
ministry. But every bishop has a public role. We are called upon to give voice to what we believe is an appropriate Christian expression of living into the common good, as your organization tries to do. And so from time to time, I have that responsibility as well. There are other duties as assigned, but I would say the bread and butter are the tending to the congregations and leaders, and then being the representative of our church, is symbolically and in physical presence, when called upon or when the situation requires.
And unlike some traditions where someone might be born into it, one is not born a bishop, right? So,
No, no one is elected, and it
okay.
is our process is this very paradoxical combination of the symbolic trappings of a hierarchy, with all of the regalia and language of authority that would give someone the impression that I call all the shots. But in fact, we're a very democratic church. Most decisions are made at the local level through a democratic process. And as I said, I was elected democratically. In our diocese, all support for the diocese in terms of how we are sustained is voluntary. And so I don't have a lot of uh, levers, if you will, of actual authority to get people to, if I wanted to do this, to do what I want them to do. It's much more persuasive and aspirational, as well as attempting to embody something of the life and teachings of Jesus in such a way that people find compelling. And you know enough about the church world to know that denominations like the Episcopal Church are not necessarily the first place that people turn to when looking for a Christian path anymore, if
Hmm.
they ever were. And
Hmm.
so there's also a real process of self-examination and revitalization and adapting an ancient tradition to a very contemporary world. Some of that is really life giving, and some of that's just hard, just
Hmm.
trying to discern what that looks like in real time.
And before you were a bishop, when we first met, you were a pastor of a congregation here in Minneapolis.
I was. Yeah,
And
I
a
was.
lot of this book is not just about how you learn to be brave when you're the bishop. This is how you learn to be brave as just a regular person, right? Like
Right,
that's
right.
um, to talk a little bit about how you ended up becoming a pastor at all. Like why did you choose the religious route and want to be somebody that was serving the
Right.
churches, but also the world in that way.
Well, as I look back on it, and I'm one of the, I would say, few people my age. I'm in my early 60s now. That the path has been remarkably singular. I was ordained young in my 20s and have been on this path, this sort of religious life, denominational leader path, all of my adult vocation practically. And that's a huge surprise to me when I think of
Hmm.
how my early years started out. But I suspect that the roots ran pretty deep in that I felt from an adolescent on forward a a deep conviction that the life and teachings of Jesus and what it meant to follow Jesus was something that had claimed me. I don't
Mm,
know that I,
mm,
I chose it, and I keep on choosing it. But it, as is often said in the scriptures and in other spiritual writings of other people that you and I both admire, there is a sense of being summoned to a life,
right.
or called to this. And I often said to people when especially when I was trying to lead that church that you mentioned and raising two small kids, that I wouldn't necessarily recommend this life to anybody, but I also wouldn't have traded it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it felt like my life, and it surprised me in that I had aspirations when I first imagined myself in this role as really living on the margins of society. I was deeply inspired by Christian leaders who chose the path of voluntary poverty, the likes of Dorothy Day or the missionaries in Central America during the Central American Wars. And I saw myself
Mm, mm,
called to that life. But as my life unfolded and as the choices came before me, I found myself drawn to a, a fairly, in the middle of the system kind of role,
uh,
right? Parish priest, and then institutional leader. And that, no one was more surprised by that than I, but I also took to it. I felt like, okay, this seems like where I belong. And frankly, I've followed it ever since. Few bumps along the way that we don't, we could go into if you want to, but there's, lots of them. But I have felt I've never felt called to veer off that path.
mm.
So here I
Yeah,
am.
and one of the genius things that you do in this book is you suggest these different ways that people are brave, and one of them is that you stay, and I think that's part of your story. Um, wh- when my kids were little and my son wanted to play football, so fifth or sixth grade, we went to football
Yeah,
practice, or I'd have a parent meeting ahead of time, and one of the parents was uh, giving a short presentation on the dangers of football, basically trying to talk parents out of this, and said, in addition to head collisions, which for fifth graders and stuff isn't so much the deal, but broken collarbones, broken wrists. So this person goes on for, I mean, what felt like a terribly long period of time, right, describing the hazards of this practice, and uh, sort of toward the end, he finally reveals something he should have said earlier, which was, and as an emergency room doctor, I see these things all the time, right? So here was a guy who, because of his role in life, he's like, I'm telling you what, about every kid I see at work comes in because he had a preset group of people who had been injured playing football. So every fall, as emergency room doctor. And I think about that a lot for those of us who are in any of the people work, helping
yeah,
professions, ministry. There's a thing that we interact with people based on our role at a time in life when they are sharing things that they might not share otherwise, or
yeah.
weddings, funerals, personal crisis, spiritual growth, someone saying, I want to go through a real change, something has happened. And so I don't know, it's almost like emergency room doctors see people when they're sick, and we see people at these moments of life, and what does it mean to be life.
I,
Do you have that sense, and did that play into how you thought about the writing of this book and the other ministry you do, but specifically what was going through your mind when you were thinking about humanity?
um, that's such a great story, by the way. And to some degree, although I don't know how conscious I was about that, except I am so drawn, as are you and most pastors I know, to the stories of people, ordinary people, not the ones that you would just assume to be able and uh, uh, destined for greatness, but people in all the frailty of humanity who are nonetheless in situations that call upon them to do something or to be someone that is absolutely needed in that moment.
Mm,
And that is, for me, one of the more faith-inspiring moments in human life.
mm,
I think I said in the book at some point that a decisive moment makes a believer out of everyone, if just for that moment, right? There is this sense of being um, called to something, it's large or small, and you step up into that.
hmm. Yeah.
Often it's in crisis. Often it's in is a result of suffering, and our traditions speak to that so powerfully. It's also like great opportunity and great joy, right?
Mm,
It's not always sadness, but it is that sense of being fully alive.
yeah.
And
Mm,
I'm drawn to that. I would say the other thing that drew me into leadership in the church, it's the individual piece that you described. But I also found myself falling in love with the experience of creating a culture or a feeling that people would have when they walked into our church,
mm,
right? Or into the sanctuary when we began worship. And I think about that every time I lead worship, although now like I'm in a different church every Sunday, so it's not mine to craft completely, but what can I do with my presence, with my being,
mm,
to create a space where people can hear what's most important for them to hear in that moment, where people can feel safe and loved and inspired and collectively part of something. And so I love that as a person who gets to participate in communal worship every week and
mm,
sometimes more than that. And I think in my writing I try to emulate that feeling of both, reaching person to person, but also to touch something more universal or communal that can, reassure us that our individual stories are not like these isolated little pods, but
hmm.
that we're part of something bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is such a smart idea to talk about bravery, but a lot of people, I know you reference this in the book, they think about it in like a hero narrative, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, if I saw a crisis going on, could I step up? Or they just kind of get some notion in their mind about what it means to be brave. And you're careful to suggest that, look, bravery is a thing that we can practice or we can work toward or we can develop the capacity for it because it comes in, as you say, in those decisive moments, which I just found reading the book such a great phrase, right? These moments that there's a long conversation that I've followed among intellectuals about kind of this debate whether there's great people or only people in great moments, right? It's a
Right.
really interesting kind of notion, and then people rise to that moment, and it's just an interesting way to think about it because it causes you to think about yourself and others in a different way. But this idea of preparation
Yes.
for a moment,
Right.
um, boy, that feels like something that our spiritual traditions have embedded in them and what they should do. And I'm not sure a lot of a lot of us kind of do that. In fact, sometimes it seems like the Christian story for a lot of people is the bailout for having to be brave, right? Like, hey, it's
Well,
not
there
my
and
fault.
I know that story really well, right?
Yeah, yeah.
A number of times I've had to pray, Lord, I got myself into this, but I'd sure appreciate a lifeline, right? But no, this idea of preparation, and I was actually talking to a young man who I think is moving toward a threshold in his life and ministry recently. And he was asking me for, among other things, my advice. And one of the things I found myself saying, was something I learned through a lot of painful stretches of life that where nothing dramatic seemed to be happening at all,
Yeah.
right? That what could I do in those times to put myself in places of opportunity later on
Mm,
where where I could be of use, or where I could step into a moment that I wasn't capable of stepping into at the time. And I think that artists and other people who have a practice that requires
mm,
being really bad for a long time until you're good, right? That you don't walk onto the stage of orchestra hall and assume your place as the first chair, right? I mean, you work toward that. And that there's something about life that is innately preparing
Hmm.
us for things. But in the spiritual life, we don't always know what we're being prepared for, right? Sometimes we
Hmm.
know, and sometimes we prepare. Speaking for myself now, I write about a stretch where I felt like I really did want, I mean, to be honest, I really wanted a chance to be a leader in a larger capacity than as the parish priest in a neighborhood in Minneapolis. I really wanted that, and in some ways I felt called to it, but I failed twice at um, at being chosen, right? And in both of those instances, I had to go back and learn, okay, if I were to equip myself, if I'm given another chance,
Hmm.
what do I need to have in my repertoire that I don't have now? And how can I move toward that? Which was a very conscious piece, right?
Hmm.
With full appreciation that there were no guarantees that it would happen, right? So I also had to make my peace
Yeah.
with the fact I could land anywhere, which is the reality of life. And so there's that. And then I think also we can look back, as I mentioned, one person that I spoke with in the book who said at a critical juncture in his life, I've been preparing my whole life for this. And it's not like he had a plan since the time he was 10, right?
Right.
You know, but he looked back and he saw the pieces in a way that said, oh yeah, this is this is the culmination of a life's journey.
Hmm.
And I'm ready. I am ready for
Hmm.
this.
All right.
It's
So,
exhilarating.
so it is exhilarating. So even though you're the bishop of the Washington Diocese of the Episcopal Church, it involves the National Cathedral, which plays a role in civic religion or in
Mhm.
civic life as a religious space. That
Right.
so things happen there, funerals happen there, inaugurations of presidents, prayers for inaugurations of presidents happen there. It's just a thing because it was built for that purpose, and you can talk as much about the cathedral as you want. But you personally and in your role are not a political person, right? Like in the sense of American politics and even Washington D.C. politics and all of that. Like you function above and outside of and supportive of all of the people in that space. In fact, we've talked a lot about that. We were both pastors, of churches at the same time. You became a bishop. I stayed in that role. I've since
Mhm.
shifted to a much more political foot forward in the work
Mhm.
that we're trying to do because I think we're just living a particular moment where the experience of
Yep.
Donald Trump is a hazard to people. So I've taken a much more specific political edge. And we've talked a lot about this. You've been a great guide. And there's been things that I'm like, hey, we're doing this with leaders. And you're like, hey, I can't do that stuff in my role. Like there's a separation. Okay, so I just want to name that your primary function is not to be a commentator on politics or on what the president is doing in the president's role or so on. And then a moment showed up, and
Right.
frankly, and I'm going on here, but frankly, I growing up as a kid in the '70s and really my teenage years in the '80s, I looked at the period of time earlier in American history, my childhood just forward, and thought, man, what would it have been like to have lived in a time of great social turmoil? I know for some reason, like it just felt like there were times when there was a
Right.
lot going on, and I wasn't in one of those. Like I was
I
living in
know.
this time.
I felt the same way, by the way. Growing up in the same man, I missed it,
I
right?
literally missed it. I missed all the good music. I missed all the good, you know. Okay, so 2016, and then really 2020 comes along, and
Right.
we're living in a pandemic. I mean, things are shutting down. People like you and your organization institution are having to scramble. I mean, no no part of our American society is as impacted by not being able to have personal meetings as churches, right? Like that's just right up there with, grocery stores. And churches were not declared to be essential spaces, so everybody, there was a lot going on, a lot of pressure. George Floyd was murdered up the street from where I am now by the Minneapolis police, and the world exploded. Partly because of that moment, partly because of the buildup of an election that was coming in Donald Trump. partly because of the pandemic, and just there was a lot. And all of a sudden, Mariann, we were all right in the middle of it, especially if you thought about the stuff like we do.
Right.
And I bring up all of that because you start the book with sort of a prelude and then sort of a postlude at the end, to use church words, saying, on whatever it was, I should look at it again, but 7:06 p.m. on June 9th or whatever. Like, you name a date of a specific moment.
Right.
When Donald Trump walked across Lafayette Square and held up a Bible in front of a church that was under your care,
Mm-hmm.
and used it as a backdrop with the military clearing people out. And that moved you into a new space differently. Can you talk a bit about that, how that felt, why
Right.
you included that as the sort of beginning of the book and all? So can you just give us a little bit more
Sure.
context? You can tell that story any way you want. I chose not to put the picture up. We've used that picture so many times in our Vote Common Good stuff. I chose not to put it up as to not,
Right.
make you have to endure it again, because it's, I'm sure it's in your mind as it is in mine. And
Right.
talk about, can you just talk a bit about that and what that felt like when you were trying to be in your role that had been so established, and now you were in a moment of, because that's the thing about decisive moments, they don't appear like you think they're going to appear. So you're
Right.
preparing for something that's going to end up looking really different.
Complete. Right. Um, Let me just widen the lens a tiny bit, because there were a couple of things that were antecedents to that moment that I think were significant in the way things rolled out. Um, First of all, being a religious leader in the Donald Trump presidency was a constant balancing act, and in terms of having to discern at any given moment how to respond to the outrageous events, decisions, and words of this former president. I mean, every morning you would wake up to the latest tweet, right? I mean, that was like the first thing that, and
Yeah.
so it was and a few of us. I mean, and so there was that. I mean, there was just that constant barrage of outrage in a moral sense, not
Hmm.
there was certainly a partisan debate going on, but there was a moral a question that was constantly being thrust into our faces, and um, and so I had that wasn't the first time that I had spoken out against something that the president had said or done. I didn't do it every week, but there were a few times when it just felt like this is in my lane, this is in my wheelhouse, and I've got to say or do something. And one was around the caging of children at the border, right? And the other was when he referred to the city of Baltimore as infested, right? An infested city. And he called upon those elected officials that were naturalized citizens from other countries to go back where they came from, right? Do you remember
Yeah,
all that?
I
And
very clearly.
and to be honest, in the cages situation, no one paid attention to what the Bishop of Washington said. And in the Baltimore piece, we got a little bit of airplay on that because it was just so. But I mean, like, so I had a little bit of, but I can't say that I went into that moment expecting to be at the center of a news cycle for 4 days, right? That just wasn't in my head because that's not how my world works anymore. I'm just not that person, and my platform isn't that influential, right? It's just
Yeah.
it's just not. For all the trappings of the cathedral, it's just not. And so those things were, but it was like this cannot go unaddressed. There was that piece. The other piece, and you played a part in this for me, Doug. You don't remember this, but the George Floyd murder was the last or the latest or the most dramatic in a series of deaths by police, black men and women by police officers or vigilante citizens that had been growing in, um, had been just becoming, it was sort of becoming like this rhythm of
Hmm.
events that were happening in the wider country uh, uh, over time. And and there was a growing sense among the people I serve, which is a significant Black population here in Washington and in the metro area, a significant sense of like, are we, what are we talking? We have got to do something about this. And I was feeling a bit, um, as I often do, late to the late, like, what do I do? What do I say? Right? How do I respond to this? And then George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, which is, not only where you live, it's where I lived for 18 years, where we still have a home where our children and our grandchildren live. And you and I were talking about your role in the sort of spontaneous outpouring in the streets of Minneapolis, and how you and other faith leaders were trying to be a faithful presence, a mediating presence, a calming presence in that intense
Mhm.
moment where there was some violence, some looting, and a whole lot of peaceful people wanting to be out there and to express their grief, their rage, their desire for change. So the day when the protests moved to Washington, and they moved pretty quickly, and people were starting to gather at Lafayette Square, which is that place between the White House and the church that we're talking about. I went down the couple of days before to meet with the leaders of that church to say, we could be a pastoral presence here on the plaza of
Mm.
St. John's. And we could offer, face masks and sanitation, we could offer
Mhm.
granola bars and water, we could pray with people, we could just be there. And the leader said, that's great, but we can't do it alone. And I said, no, of course not. Let me work on galvanizing other people across our churches, and we'll work on this, right? So we started doing that, and then the next night, someone threw a fire torch in the church, right? You may not remember that, but someone
Yeah.
threw. So for about, again, another part of the news, St. John's Church is up in flames, and it was a minor fire that was attended to very quickly. And we, the leaders of the church, decided, okay, we don't like the fact that our church was affected in this way, but we're not going to lose focus. We're going to keep our focus on
Mm.
the main thing, which was that a police officer murdered a person, and
Yeah.
we have, so we were just, so all of this was building, right? And then the next day, President Trump was in the Rose Garden after he had berated mayors across the country for being such wimps, in his words, and threatening to bring in military force against peaceful protesters. So that was in the afternoon. And that was what I was listening
Mhm.
to.
Yeah.
And then this event, which we've all talked about and we all know. And I actually didn't see it in real time. It wasn't covered on
Mhm.
I was watching the news with my mom, but my people just started calling me and texting me and telling me this was happening. And I just thought, I don't, I don't know what to do. So I called a couple of communications people. I said, what do I do? What do I say? And one person just said, look, the sun cannot go down without hearing from you. And I thought, you're absolutely right. And I said, oh,
Mm.
he said, let me see if I can, I have someone at CNN. Let me see if I can call them. I called the religious editor of the Washington Post, who I happen, she interviews me from time to time. I happen to have her cell
Mhm.
phone. And I just started talking. And little did I know, she's tweeting as I'm talking, right? The bishop says it. And I'm just blathering, right? Melissa, this is an outrage. And then it got picked up, right? So, but I wasn't, it was a culmination of a lot of
Mhm.
things that I was feeling like I need to so I was sort of praying and
Mm.
asking, and and then as sometimes happen, not very often, there's this confluence of, of a lot of people staying at home watching television, a lot of
Yeah.
people out on the streets themselves, a lot of religious leaders just thinking, "Oh my God, what are we seeing?" To be fair, a lot of other religious leaders saying, "Yes, we believe that Donald Trump is our not only our political leader but our religious leader as well." And he was
Mhm.
claiming that mantle. He was using, it was code language, right, to his base, his evangelical base. And I knew no matter, I had no idea that it was going to touch as many people as as it seemed to, but I just knew that um, that authority did not belong to him. And I had to muster up everything I had inside me to claim it back, right? To say, that's not his, that's ours. And we stand for something else. And we need a president who calms people down rather than riles them up in moments like that. And not only was it an abdication of his authority, it was a
Hmm.
misuse of religious
Yeah.
authority. And so yeah, I can still get adrenaline thinking about it, and then as with other things, and I write about this too, and then it's over, right? Then it's over. The moment is over, right?
Yeah.
But so I rode the wave of it for as long as the wave needed me, and then I had to think, okay, what are the implications of what happened for the rest of my life and the life of our churches, and so it's
Yeah.
not, yeah. So that's
Well,
that.
well,
That's why.
it was
I
such a
want
great
to say,
service, and I want to
yeah,
ask you a couple of questions about it because part of what it did for people like me, and I know many other faith leaders, um, it was just so hard during those years to know what was normal, and
right,
it was so easy to be outraged by so many things, and it didn't seem right that the president would use a church as the backdrop, hold up a Bible, and basically condone the clearing of protesters and law and order narrative. And I mean, there's
well,
just so many things going on. But also, people were just unsure about, well, who gets to speak? Because that's the thing about religion in America, especially for religious leaders, and you're stepping up and saying, look, I have a particular vested interest in this place. This is one of the churches inside of our community that I have something to say about. And that's like somebody using, my house as the backdrop.
right.
So it freed up people to say, well, even the bishop of the Washington diocese has said this is wrong. And I'm sure people imbued the bishop of the Washington diocese of the Episcopal Church with a whole level of power and authority that you don't have and that they
I
never
don't
even
know,
thought about. I mean, they probably didn't even know there were bishops in a diocese, but just seemed
right?
like, I don't know, there was a religious leader in Washington,
Right,
D.C. that said no. And
right.
so there was certainly all that going on, which I'm guessing you tried to keep out of your head a little bit. Did you feel nervous about this? Did your bravery require you to have to keep some of the more concerning voices in your own head at bay? Like, what did you think? Hey, I can't screw this one up. Like, I'm walking I'm walking the bridge here, and I don't want to fall left. I don't want to fall right. I just need to stay straight. Or were you not? Like, how did that all go? Because in the book you talk about it and it's great. But even though I know you well and we've only talked a little bit about it, this is sort of a place to ask, like, what was going on inside your own emotional sensibility at that time? How unnerved were you about not wanting to become, an example of how not to do this?
Um, in the the night itself, and I would say the first day or two afterwards, I wasn't thinking. I was not in a thinking part of my brain. It was more of an automatic response, right? It was, and I
Hmm.
described it. It was kind of like a baseball player at the
Yeah.
bat, right? It was just get up there and swing, right? I would say that the thought process you described was much more operative in the days that followed,
Hmm.
because there was a lot of energy coming toward me and coming toward our little staff that felt like this could be mishandled.
Hmm.
This could be misconstrued. And in a couple of ways, one of which I write about, which is it placed too much focus on us rather than on the protesters who were, sitting out in the hot sun all day, day after day, trying to lend their bodies and their voices to something that. So there was that. Just undue focus, and displacement
Hmm.
of focus. And then the second one, which is, I think, it's something I have to watch in my own life, is not to assume that that moment
Hmm.
is the thing,
Yeah.
right? Like that's not it. That's a moment of symbolic leadership, but it's not leadership, right? It's the leadership happens when all the lights and the microphones and everybody's gone,
Yeah.
and you're still faithful, right? I think we're in a time now where the pendulum around conversations about race and racial justice, the pendulum has so swung, right?
Mhm.
And now is the time where it's really important to stay in the game, in the conversation, and live through
Yeah.
this time. And so I've had enough, little experience of that to know how tempting it is to want to keep to look for the next light, next
Yeah.
big day when you can be but that's the danger.
Yes.
And so for about a month or two, I was called upon to do all sorts of things, right? To speak at this and that, and I had to, I kind of had to choose carefully, and
Mm.
also to remember, okay, this is going to die down pretty soon. And when I was invited to write the book, and it was because of this, right? I mean, I don't want to. I was invited by two really lovely literary agents to write a book after they read some of the things I had said, and they asked me. I said, well, they said, if you could write about anything, what would you write about? And I knew I wanted to write about this, but this in the big picture, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Not in the look at what happened on June 1st thing. I mean, I don't want to shirk that. I don't want to pretend like that wasn't a big deal. It was. But the longer arc of life and the passages of faithfulness and courage are measured by a different kind of fruitfulness,
Mhm.
and that's what I wanted to encourage us all to remind myself about, to be inspired by the people to tell the stories of the people who really inspire me. And all the stories I chose in terms of civil rights, with the exception of Martin Luther King, are people who lived during a time when they were not going to see a lot of fruit for their efforts. Right? I mean, it was one slog after another through the 30s and 40s and 50s. Right? And these were not heady times, but those people and their witness, I think, are especially instructive in the times we're living now.
Well, and that's part of the genius of this book. So I really hope the book again is called "How We Learn to Be Brave" for people that are just watching or listening on the podcast version of this. That this kind of brave look, most people's bravery doesn't have to involve a conversation for 3 minutes with Anderson Cooper, in a moment of social political crisis. Um,
Yes.
it, that's not how life sort of goes, and it's a good thing, right? Because that's a certain kind of bravery. um y- so I'll just lay out how you've structured the book. And first of all, it's so well written, and I love an author who starts a book and tells us how it's going to go. And in the introduction at the end, you're like, okay, in chapter 1, here's what we're going to discuss, in 2 and 3 and 4. Like, oh, that's great. um
Communications 101, right?
Yeah, yeah. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And it's sort of classic. Did you know how this was all going to go when you laid it out? And I'll give a brief description of the
Yeah.
book. Did you know that going in? Like, was this material you're already working on? Because you start out by saying, look, there's bravery that's required when you have to stay, chapter on that. There's bravery at a time when you have to go. Well, I guess the other way around, starting with you have to
Oh,
go and then you have to stay. Um, It's funny as I've thought about this and even wrote it down, my little sticky note, so I would have them all here. I wrote down stay first and then go. And then just now I said it, even though I'm looking at a sticky note right there on my thing that says go first, somehow because I think staying requires more bravery than going. I don't know. We could talk about
yeah,
in a minute.
I I
Because you often think like, bravery is it's time now to hero's journey and all that stuff. You have to go. And I don't know, something about saying. But anyway, one of the chapters is about what it takes to go, what it takes to stay, what it takes to start a new journey, what it takes to accept a situation that you didn't ask for, and how you're brave in a thing when you're like, I didn't make any of this. This isn't not a lot of human agency here. My bravery is having to come from somewhere else. And then
yeah,
this idea of stepping up, like you experienced in the story, and then this bit about perseverance and experiencing the letdown after Bravery, after a
Mhm.
time when you feel like it's good. Did you know all that? Like go, stay, start, step up, accept. Was that already in your head? Was that a sermon series you had worked on? Like how did it all find itself into this little gem here that we call How We Learn to Be Brave?
Um, well, I had to write an outline, right? I had to write the beginnings of an actual outline, and this would have been in the summer of 2020, late in the summer. And I sat down and I thought about the things that you just said, and um, I would say that it is material that it's really the culmination of a lot of my work, right? And a lot of, although I wound up doing far more research than I anticipated, just because writing a book is really different than writing a sermon, because you have to be a lot more clear, a lot more precise, and all of that. But I had the basic themes, and it gave me a structure in which to think more deeply about some of the seasons in my own life,
Mm,
and also in the lives of people that I admire, both historically and personally, and also the great stories of literature and film and mythology, certainly
mm,
scripture, that I wanted to highlight. And I am, I am at heart a pastor and a religious leader. And part of my hope was to describe for people who may not be active or participants in a faith tradition, to have a sense of what it's like
mm,
when you live a faith tradition in such a way that the stories and the spiritual uh, power of that tradition takes up residence inside you for a time, right? And allows me to do things that I wouldn't have otherwise thought possible, because I felt like I was stepping into something that didn't rely on my energy alone, right?
mm,
That if it
mm,
had been up to me, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But there's a sense of like, okay, you're not alone. There is this power. For me as a Christian, it's all wrapped up around the presence and the love of Jesus, and but also just the whole arc of the biblical narrative. And I wanted to bring that to light as well, like how that can
mm,
be a resource for human beings, not in a, I wanted to be accessible for everybody, but I wanted to be clear about that, right? That's available to us, right? So in a sense, I had everything to work with. I just never had the opportunity to put it all together. And it
mm.
took a long time. It took 2.5 years. And it was among one of the hardest things I've ever done, because I just had to keep going, right? I mean, I wrote that chapter on perseverance, and part of it was like this, as you've written many books, it takes a lot of
Mhm.
perseverance to just carve out the space to do it, right? A lot of trial and error. And I had help, these wonderful women just kind of helped me, and other people helped me along the way. So that's how it came to be.
Yeah.
And
There's this thing in the internet world that's kind of a little words of wisdom. Don't read the comments, right? When people comment on things. When
uh,
you're an author, you're like, don't read your previous drafts. Like, just don't, because
right.
you'll start
Oh
telling
God.
yourself, there's no
Yeah.
way anyone's going to read this. Why did they, they're going to find out that, even if you've written before, you're just like, I
I
don't know.
know.
It's the magic is gone. It is run
Yes,
out.
it
So,
is. I feel that
it,
every week when I try to write a sermon. It's like, okay, this is the week. It's just not going to happen, right? You're
yep.
just not going to get a sermon this week. And so that's part of it too. It's um, yeah, I mean that that's a whole other just the whole artistic process
Yeah.
is that combination of whatever comes to us from a source that is beyond us, and then just the work that you put in to try to bring it to life.
And look, this is a terrific book for ordinary people that see themselves as just like, hey, I just live my life. I
Mhm.
like ordinary. You have to be brave every day. All that. But it's also really important for leaders. I think it seems to me, and I think you're really good at speaking to this, that there's just a leadership crisis across our society in nearly every sector. I hear it from a lot of people. There's kind of a lack of like moral leadership and just a sense that leaders are going to do the right thing.
Mm.
There, I'm not saying we live in a world that needs certain special people to do the right thing, and the rest of us, are just, you know, fodder for the human experience. But boy, leaders make a big difference. That's why in every part of our society, we, endow people with certain capacity to do things that other people, we don't let them do,
Right.
whether it's the captain of your bowling team, the organizer of your pickleball deal, or your bishop. You just say to some people, you get to do some things because the rest of us won't. And we really need people to do those things in a way that is good and right and brave. And I don't know, it just feels like, um, of all the things that haven't gotten better in my lifetime, because so many things have gotten better, on the list of things that haven't gotten better are people doing the right thing as leaders. I don't know. At least it feels that way. And
Mm.
do you have a sense of any of that? Can you give me some pastoral advice that maybe the world's better than I think it is, or
Yeah.
or were you thinking about this at all? Were you thinking about leaders? I mean, it's hard to live in Washington, D.C. and not think about people who see themselves as leaders. The place is just crawling with those
All
who lead
right.
things. I mean, it's
Right.
it's very
Right.
leader focused kind of place.
Yeah. Well, leadership is quite the it's a big topic of discussion on all fronts, right? I mean, it's everywhere, and I would say that it's there's lots of reason to be optimistic because there are so many inspiring people to turn to who are doing good work and inspiring others to do good work. And there is this countervailing um, uh, force
Mm.
of real. Uh, I mean, I read the paper every day, and I think, oh my goodness,
Right.
how how much time do we have?
Yeah.
How are we going to make it? Is this? Do we have what it takes as a species to rise to this moment? And in whatever way that that moment presents itself to us. And I can I can be as discouraged as anyone about that. Or as I was talking to someone else the other day, listening to young people and wondering kind of where people in their 20s and 30s find their hope these days,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and so where I have to fall back to all every time is, those people that are authentically leading in whatever realm they're in, be it a parent or a
Hmm.
president, and not speaking necessarily about just anyone who just steps into that arena as with as much integrity as they can, and perhaps maybe, and this is the we're also pretty unforgiving in our society right now.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to do was to say, look, we all have feet of clay here, and we all make big mistakes, and we, on some level, we have to factor that into the equation too, right? All of us are fallible. And so how do we take that part of who we
Yeah.
are and offer that, right? And I yeah, I'm rambling here, so I'm obviously
No,
not answering.
I'm glad you are, and that's actually a topic that we're going to do a little bit of work on here in the Vote Common Good world, on this issue of redemption and what that can
Right.
mean. Like, there is an important thing that our faith communities and from the Christian tradition calls us to justice. There's little question, I think, in anyone's
Right.
mind that our call is for the world to look more like the inclusion and the care and the love of God, the kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And we should call this out, and we should do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God, all of that. And that story also includes redemption narratives. In fact, you don't have a biblical narrative that's not
Right.
someone did not fulfill the calling of God, and then was called into a graceful, redemptive, repentance, whatever project, and they changed. Those are the right stories. I was blind and now I see. However people tell that story, it's so powerful. It's so essential to being human beings. So every tradition has it,
Right.
and it feels like a real missing piece in the current American conversation, and especially in the progressive justice spaces.
And
That
I,
um,
yeah, I live in that a lot right now. And um, I, I was in a conversation the other day, and this happens to me quite a bit now because we're doing a lot of work around racial reparations, which is in the Episcopal Church a pretty tender topic
mhm,
because our churches go all the way back to the colonial era in some parts of the country, and particularly this one. And so the slave trade is a part of our past, as is every other era of racial injustice in this country that's embedded in our architecture and the
yeah,
neighborhoods where our churches are. I mean, there's just no getting around it, right?
right,
And and for some who are pushing this conversation forward, there is just a sense of urgency and in, I don't want to say impatience in the sense of they're not interested. They just know they just know that this is the right thing for us to do, and they are very clear. And I am, as I often am, um, in the midst of a community where there's a lot of different perspectives on this. And if we're going to move, a certain portion of us can be right, right? But it's not necessarily going to move the whole body forward, right? That's not how we have to have some space where it's okay to get this wrong and we can still be in the conversation. And others will say, but then, you're giving, white people's discomfort primacy
mhm,
over the cause of justice. And I don't have an answer to that because it's true, right? I mean,
mhm,
it's right. So it's like, no, okay, I hear that. So maybe some of us are called to that edge, right? To that, that prophetic edge. And maybe others of us are called to like help the body of humanity move toward that vision, right? Whatever the vision is. Um, and that includes some generosity around the edges and some curiosity,
yeah,
and some forgiveness. Um, but I'm not going to ask somebody who is in a very different place in terms of their life experiences and their losses and their trials to be that person if that's not what they feel called to do, because I can't do that, right? I just have to I have to stay in the room where I'm uncomfortable and also try to create a space where we can have transformative conversations and generous ones. And like you said, in this climate right now, it's not easy, and I'm
yeah,
living it. I'm living it in real time.
yeah,
So
and we experience it across our system. The what's
yeah,
often referred to as the justice system, which people who are close to it and families like mine that have been impacted by it are pretty sure it's not always about justice. It's about
not a lot.
punishment and some other thing. We'll say regularly we need to have a system that isn't so punitive. People are more than the worst thing they've ever done when we're speaking about those justice issues. And sometimes the very conversation about that doesn't treat people who have not always seen things in the best of light with the same level of grace.
With the same level of generosity, um, and that's a um, and that's not a that kind of context in my world. It is very rare, and typically what happens is that there are whole sectors of our church that basically say any political topic is off the table because
Yeah.
we're trying to create a safe space. And the way we're going to do that is we're just not going to talk politics. And politics doesn't mean partisanship. It means
Yeah.
anything, any issue that has risen into the political agenda, right? Gun violence,
Yeah.
abortion, trans kids, we're just not going to talk about it. And it's effective in that community. We're just going to, everyone can come and you're going to be safe, but we're not talking about it. And
Yeah.
then there are, darn it, we are going to talk about it. And how to have that conversation
Wow.
that's my life right now. And I don't know how it's going to turn out.
I mean, it's curious. You think about people sort of our ages that at some point in the 70s or 80s were like, boy, what I wouldn't give to live in a time of great social conflict. And what how would I have been like, oh yeah, yeah. How's that going for you then?
Well, here we are. We don't get to pick, right? We just get to
Sure
choose
don't.
how we live, right?
Yeah.
So,
But yeah, that's right. That's right. You don't get to pick the context, but you do have some agency in what you do and how
right.
you live. And you, my dear friend, have chosen to contribute, among other things, this great book, How We Learn to Be Brave, which is spectacular. And you chose to be on this little podcast, and that means the world to me, and I'm sure to everybody who's watching this. So everyone should go buy this book, and if they're ever in Washington D.C. on some given Sunday, they should try to find one of the 86 churches that you could possibly be in on that given day and find where's the bishop.
Yeah.
Where's the bishop today? And the cathedral is not the place to go. I've had some friends that are like, hey, I'm going to Washington, D.C. I'm going to stop by and see your friend, the bishop, because I brag about you being my friend all the time. And they're like, I went to the cathedral. She wasn't there. I'm like, yeah, unfortunately, that's not how that works. He doesn't just,
Right. Right.
there is somebody who handles that. It's not the bishop. And that just confuses people all the more. Like,
It's very confusing.
I
Thank
have
you,
no
Doug.
idea. Well, thank
Thank
you,
you for
friend.
what you do. You are also striving to be brave and courageous and generous in your work and your conversations. And I do believe you're called to this, and that you are making a difference in ways that perhaps will never be known to you, but will be lived out in the lives of many people who will be the beneficiaries of your efforts. Thanks. Honored to
Well,
call you my friend.
well, thank you. I accept that blessing from my bishop.
Thank you.
I mean, seriously, how about that, huh? Bishop Mariann, just the best. By the way, if you're still watching this, you're a super watcher. Thank you. And you're probably thinking, that's the third shirt Doug gets worn in this one live stream. Yes, in the middle of that, I had to change shirts. And then recorded that yesterday or 2 days ago with Bishop Mariann Budde. Again, the book, How We Learn to Be Brave, really, it's terrific. If you've got a group or just you as an individual that's looking for something to read, something to engage with, do that. It was good to see Chris and Mike and Yabitz and Jim and Linda all on the chat. Share this with a friend. Poke it around. If you're listening on the podcast, we rarely ever say this, but go to the places where like you give recommendations and say that you like this podcast, because goodness grief, if you're listening for an hour to us, maybe 3 times a week, you obviously like it. So let other people know that you do. We'll be back tomorrow. Today is Wednesday. Tomorrow we'll be talking early in the morning, 8 a.m. Central Time, with astrophysicist Paul Wallace. All right. So thanks for being a part of this today. Thank you especially to Bishop Mariann Budde of the Episcopal Church of Washington, D.C. And we'll see you all later.